Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 4, The Origin of Freemasonry, the 1717 theory exploded by Chalmers I, Paton. The rapid extension of Freemasonry in Britain and other countries. After the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717, confirms the argument derived from the speedy accession of noblemen and other persons of distinction to the Masonic body. It cannot reasonably be imagined that a newly invented scheme, however ingenious, should have at once received the approbation of men in all parts of Britain. But we find lodges already existing in all parts of the country at once to have cordially accepted it, and new lodges to have been formed on the same principles. The only supposition which can be entertained is that the old lodges recognized in it the system on which they had originally been founded, and that therefore Masons in all parts of the kingdom gladly acknowledged the new Grand Lodge and attached themselves to it. The extension of Masonry after 1717 was very rapid in England. In 1730 the Grand Lodge of Ireland was founded, and the Grand Lodge of Scotland in 1736. The foundation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland took place under circumstances already partially referred to, and which sufficiently indicate the connection of the modern Freemasonry carried on by the Grand Lodge and the affiliated lodges in Scotland with a more ancient Freemasonry existing in that country. William St. Clair of Roslin, finding it necessary to part with his estate of Roslin, with the possession of which his tenure of the office of Grand Master was connected, according to the original grant from James II of Scotland, and having at heart the interests of the Order of Freemasons, resolved to resign his office, at the same time recommending that the Masons of Scotland should form a Grand Lodge and elect for themselves a Grand Master. The following letter was therefore sent by the lodges in Edinburgh and its neighbourhood to all the lodges in Scotland, inviting them to appear on next St. Andrew's Day by themselves or their representatives to take part in the election of a Grand Master. Brethren, the four lodges in and about Edinburgh, having taken into their serious consideration the great loss that Masonry has sustained through the want of a Grand Master, authorized us to signify to you, our good and worthy brethren, our hearty desire and firm intent to choose a Grand Master for Scotland. And in order that the same may be done with the greatest harmony, we hereby invite you, as we have done all the regular lodges known by us, to concur in such a great and good work, whereby it is to be hoped Masonry may be restored to its ancient lustre in this kingdom. And for effectuating this laudable design, we humbly desire that, betwixt this and Martinmas Day next, you will be pleased to give us a brotherly answer in relation to the election of a Grand Master, which we propose to be on St. Andrew's Day for the first time, and ever thereafter to be on St. John the Baptist's Day, or as the Grand Lodge shall appoint by the majority of voices, which are to be collected from the masters and wardens of all the regular lodges then present, or by proxy to any master mason or fellow craft in any lodge in Scotland, and the election is to be in Mary's Chapel. All that is hereby proposed is for the advancement and prosperity of Masonry in its greatest and most charitable perfection. We hope and expect a suitable return, wherein, if any lodges are defective, they have themselves only to blame. We heartily wish you all manner of success and prosperity, and ever are, with great respect, your affectionate and loving brethren, etc. Now let it be remembered that this letter was written scarcely 19 years after the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England. And let us see how it bears on the 1717 theory, the theory which ascribes the origin of modern Freemasonry to the date of the foundation of that Grand Lodge. We must bear in mind that there was then no such intimate connection between England and Scotland as through railways and telegraphs exists at the present day, and therefore the foundation of the Grand Lodge in England was not likely to have such immediate effect in the northern part of the island as might now be expected from such an event. Let us look at the letter of the lodges of Edinburgh and its neighbourhood, keeping these circumstances in view. We see in it evidence of the existence of a system of Freemasonry long anterior to its date. It is plainly written on the assumption that such a system has long existed and is known as already in existence by those to whom it is addressed. And these are not individuals scattered throughout Scotland, but regularly organized lodges, the existence of which is proof sufficient of the prior existence of a system of Masonry in Scotland. We have this proof, in fact, in the existence of the lodges in Edinburgh and its neighbourhood. which united to send the letter, and in that of the lodges to which it is addressed. Can any reasonable man suppose that all this had sprung up after 1717, and in consequence of the action of Dr. Desaguliers and Dr. Anderson? The letter of the Edinburgh Masons in 1736 plainly proceeds on the assumption of an ancient system recognized as existing, and in the advancement of which the brethren throughout the country are expected to take an interest. We find also that 32 lodges responded to the call and concurred in the formation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. The very names of some of these lodges are indicative of antiquity and of connection with a system not of very recent introduction, as that of the Canongate Kilwinning, the Kilwinning Scotch Arms, the Kilwinning Leith, the Kilwinning Glasgow, Kilwinning Torfichan, etc. It is easy for the advocates of the 1717 theory to ridicule the pretensions of the Kilwinning Lodge, Mother Kilwinning, to high antiquity, as its oldest records have unhappily been destroyed or lost. But it is not so easy to get over the fact of the existence of lodges which profess to have derived their charters from it and which have assumed its name as a name of honorable distinction in their own. That lodges so designated existed in 1736 is clear enough from the records connected with the foundation of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and this is enough for our present purpose. That these lodges were founded after 1717 and owed their origin to the movement which took place in England in that year is a notion too ridiculous to require serious consideration. And if they are acknowledged, as they must be, to have had a prior existence, or to have derived their origin from some other source, the argument against the 1717 theory is conclusive. The further proceedings of the Masons of Scotland in 1736 consist with the theory of the antiquity of Freemasonry and are utterly inconsistent with that of its novel origin. They received from William St. Clair of Roslin a renunciation of his rights as their patron, protector, judge, or master. And in the deed of resignation he assigns as a reason for it that his holding or claiming any such jurisdiction, right or privilege, might be prejudicial to the craft and vocation of Masonry, of which, he says, I am a member. If Masonry was a mere novelty in Scotland in 1736, William St. Clair of Roslin must have laboured under a strange mistake, and the other Masons of Scotland must have been mistaken along with him. All this, however, and much more of the same nature, is implied in the maintenance of the 1717 theory. William St. Clair of Roslin must have made his deed of renunciation of his ancient hereditary rights under a delusion, and the Masons of Scotland must have accepted it under a delusion, believing their order and their lodges to have had an ancient existence, whilst in fact they had newly sprung into being. We have, however, another proof of the existence of Freemasonry in Scotland long before the beginning of the 17th century in the Lodge St. John, Melrose, the oldest existing records of which are prior to the year 1600. The older records of the lodge have been lost, but those existing suffice for the purpose of our present argument. The St. John Lodge, Melrose, has never connected itself with the Grand Lodge of Scotland, but has maintained an independent existence, claiming an antiquity even greater than that of the Kilwinning Lodge, known in Scottish Freemasonry as Mother Kilwinning, from which other lodges are proved to have derived their charters and to deduce their connection. Its working, however, has been entirely in accordance with that of the Grand Lodge and the lodge's holding of it. In this respect, it perfectly corresponds in its system of Freemasonry with the system ordinarily prevalent in Scotland. That it has records dating from the latter part of the 16th century is enough for our purpose as establishing the fact of the existence of Freemasonry in Scotland at that date and exploding the 1717 theory. The records of the Masonic Lodge at Melrose also plainly show that amongst its members and its masters were persons of high consideration in the district, not operative Masons, as the exigencies of the 1717 theory would require. The extension of Freemasonry throughout the world was very rapid after the foundation of the Grand Lodge of England. Lodges were founded in the British colonies, in India, and in many countries of Europe. It is not necessary here to state in detail the circumstances which attended the foundation of these lodges. That the impulse was given from England is not to be denied, and every brother must gratefully acknowledge the obligations of the order to Desaguliers, Anderson, Paton, and others, who contributed so much to the revival of the system, the excellence of which they appreciated. Nothing, however, can be more incredible than the notion that a perfectly new system, essentially different from anything that had formerly existed, was thus rapidly and widely extended. The contrary supposition commends itself at once to the mind that there existed throughout the world a system of masonry, of which that propagated from England was acknowledged as an improvement, but upon the foundation of which it was established. Of any other theory, it is impossible to account for the formation of Mason lodges in different parts of the continent of Europe in the early part of the 18th century, and for the constancy of their members under persecution, to which in several countries they were subjected. It has been alleged that Freemasonry was introduced into France by British refugees after the Revolution of 1688. There is no reason to doubt that the Jacobites who fled from Britain at that time carried with them their Freemasonry, but there is good reason to believe that they found it already existing in France. In 1645, 43 years before the Revolution in England, a particular jurisdiction of Masonry, Masonry, was established in France. It related especially to the questions concerning operative Masonry, which, however, was thus distinguished from every other operative industry. And the Masons were entitled to appeal to the Parliament of Paris, in which their advocates were allowed to plead. The high and peculiar distinction thus granted to them is worthy of consideration. It shows that a system of Masonry existed in France in the middle of the 17th century, upon which the improvements introduced from England at a later date might be grafted. At what date they were introduced, it is impossible to say, but there is reason to think that it was before 1717. About the beginning of the 18th century, the French gave a singular preeminence to Scottish Masonry and added the title of Chevalier Macon Écossais to the 3 symbolical degrees of Masonry. The French Masons invented new degrees and made other innovations in the system of Freemasonry, not consistent with its principles and original design. Their lodges also were transmuted into political clubs, a fact not difficult to be accounted for when the political circumstances of the time are considered, but inconsistent with all the principles of Freemasonry, and in the end most hurtful, because it led to the entertainment in high quarters of most erroneous opinions as to the nature and tendencies of Freemasonry. The assemblies of Freemasons were prohibited by royal edict in France in 1737, on the pretense that beneath their inviolable secrets they might cover some design hostile to religion and dangerous to the kingdom. The edict, however, was not enforced, and Masonry continued to flourish in France throughout the latter part of the 18th century. It is not necessary here to give a particular account of the spread of Freemasonry in the British colonies and on the continent of Europe. A few sentences from Laurie's History of Freemasonry may suffice, as bearing upon the present argument and showing the extreme improbability of the notion that the whole system was originated in 1717. In 1729, Laurie says, it was introduced into the East Indies, and a short time after a provincial Grand Master was appointed to superintend the lodges in that quarter. In 1730, the Grand Lodge of Ireland was instituted. Lodges were erected in different parts of America, and a provincial deputation granted to Monsieur Toinus for the Circle of Lower Saxony. In 1731, a patent was sent from England to erect a lodge at The Hague, in which Francis Stephen, Duke of Lorraine, afterwards Emperor of Germany, was initiated, and provincial Grand Masters were appointed for Russia and Andalusia in Spain. In 1736, lodges were erected at Geneva and Cape Coast in Africa, and provincial deputations were granted for Upper Saxony and the American islands. In 1738, a lodge was instituted at Brunswick under the patronage of the Grand Lodge of Scotland, in which Frederick III of Prussia was initiated when Prince Royal, and so pleased was His Highness with the maxims and ceremonies of the order that he ever afterwards was its most zealous supporter, and even requested that a lodge should be erected in the capital of his dominions. In this lodge, many of the German princes were initiated, who afterwards filled the office of Grand Master with much honor to themselves and advantage to the fraternity. Laurie's History of Freemasonry, edition of 1859, page 61. It is difficult to imagine that all this resulted from the inventive genius of Dr. Desaguliers and Dr. Anderson, The more probable theory is that there existed in Germany, Russia and Spain, as well as in France, and so in fact throughout Europe, a system of masonry of which their revival and improvement were readily accepted. How otherwise the system could have been accepted at all, and that so widely and generally, it is impossible to conceive. Those who maintain the 1717 theory are certainly bound to adduce the most positive evidence in support of it, and this they have hitherto failed to do. The persecutions of Freemasonry in different parts of Europe afford us another argument of the same kind. Would men, it may be asked, have endured persecution and still continued faithful to their Masonic obligations if these had had no other origin than the inventive genius of Dr. Desaguliers or of Elias Ashmole? Would they have felt them of any such force as facts show that they did? Would not the whole thing have seemed to them ridiculous? And although at first it might have attracted them as a novelty, would they not have flung it away when it came to be placed in competition with liberty and fortune, as was sometimes the case? It is no reply to this argument to say that they were deceived. For in the first place, there is no proof of any intention to deceive. In the second place, there is no imaginable motive for deception. And in the third place, a deception so successful and extensive cannot reasonably be supposed possible. If men had not been convinced of the truth and value of the system, they would have given up the contest at once. They did not do so. They maintained it as a good and useful system. And surely many of them must have been men of intelligence, as capable of judging as their successors at the present day. These persecutions, Laurie says, took their rise in Holland in the year 1735. The States General were alarmed at the rapid increase of Freemasons, who held their meetings in every town under their government. And as they could not believe that architecture and brotherly love were their only objects, they resolved to discountenance their proceedings. In consequence of this determination, an edict was issued by government, stating that though they had discovered nothing in the practices of the fraternity, either injurious to the interests of the Republic, or contrary to the character of good citizens, yet, in order to prevent any bad consequences which might ensue from such associations, they deemed it prudent to abolish their assemblies. Notwithstanding this prohibition, a respectable lodge having continued to meet at Amsterdam, intelligence was communicated to the authorities, who arrested all the members and brought them to the Tribunal of Justice. Before this tribunal, in presence of all the magistrates of the city, the masters and wardens boldly defended themselves and declared upon oath that they were loyal subjects, faithful to their religion and zealous for the interests of their country. That Freemasonry was an institution venerable in itself and useful to society, and that though they could not reveal the secrets and ceremonies, they would assure them that they were contrary neither to the laws of God nor man, that they would willingly admit into their order any one of their number, from whom they would receive such information as would satisfy any reasonable mind. In consequence of these declarations, the brethren were dismissed, and the town secretary requested to become a member of the fraternity. After initiation, he returned to the Court of Justice and gave such a favorable account of the principles and practice of the society that all the magistrates became brethren and patrons of the fraternity. Laurie, pages 61 and 62, had this story related to a remote period as the 12th or 13th century, it would doubtless have been ridiculous as incredible. But as it relates to last century, this is out of the question. However, it is important to observe that its date is only 8 years after that memorable one, 1717, and everyone can judge for himself if it is likely that a newly invented system, introduced by imposture in London in 1717, would have acquired such strength in 1735 at Amsterdam. The persecutions of the Freemasons in different parts of Europe in the latter part of the 18th century show how strongly the system had taken root and how determined its adherents were to maintain it. In 1738, a papal bull was issued against all Freemasons and all who promoted or favored their cause. This bull was followed by an edict dated the 17th of January 1739, condemning all Freemasons in the Papal States to the galleys, the rack, and a fine of 1,000 crowns in gold. In consequence of these enactments at Rome, the The Roman Catholic clergy of Holland in 1740 attempted to enforce obedience to the commands of their superiors. It was customary among the priests of that country to examine the religious qualifications of those who requested a certificate to receive the Holy Sacrament. Taking advantage of their spiritual power, they concluded the examination of the candidates by asking if they were Freemasons. If they were, the certificate was refused and they were expelled forever from the communion table. Laurie's History of Freemasonry, page 64. But the States General interfered, finding that respectable men were thus shut out from the communion table, and prohibited the priests from asking questions that were not connected with the religious character of the applicants. It would be easy to go on showing the persecutions to which Freemasons were subjected in different parts of Europe during the latter half of the 18th century. It is, however, unnecessary. A mere example or two will serve the present purpose, as well as a full and detailed account. That purpose is to show that Freemasonry must have existed for a long time prior to 1717, and that it did not spring into existence on the continent of Europe by mere transplantation from England, but found its origin in an ancient system long prevalent there. Not otherwise can we reasonably account for the extension of the order, for its being joined by princes and nobles, for the endurance of persecution by its members. All these things being considered, it seems utterly incredible that Dr. Desaguliers and Dr. Anderson invented and introduced a new system, but on the contrary, in the highest degree probable, that they found, as they said, a system already existing, which they deemed it worthy of their utmost exertions to extend. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.